Which is the best art style for an indie game developer to select when they're making their very first game? We're going to go through a tier list ranking. I'm going to rank the art styles from best to not as best. And then I'm going to have some other folks on our team. They're not going to agree with me, so you'll see just how wrong they are and how right I am. But I'd love for you to give your comments as well below. Here are the art styles we're going through. Monochromatic, hand-painted, voxel, isometric, pixel, cel-shaded, anime, stylized, 3D, vector, low poly, and photorealistic. Now, here's the criteria that I'm going to use. So, the skill required to make it, the time it takes to create it, how good is it going to look in the game, and then also the developer skill required to get it into the game. We'll start with monochromatic. So good examples of monochromatic might be Limbo. That's one of my favorite monochromatic games. I also really like the look of the, The Return of the Obra Dinn. And a colleague of mine way back in the day made a really cool indie game that always stands in my mind as being monochromatic, which was called Dark Echo, which is all about you kind of bounce out wave and it bounces off the cavern walls, and that's how you move around. And I think that's the theme of monochromatic. It's usually black and white with just a hint of splash of color, a bit of red every now and again, a bit of blue every now and again, but it's predominantly that black and white. So I think it has a really punchy look. Like Limbo looks amazing. I like it in terms of simplicity. I think you're only working with 2 colors, so that you need a reasonable artistic eye, but I think you can hide a lot. It's like making a horror game. You just sort of have it all black with a bit of a flashlight every now and again. So you can hide a lot. I'm going to start off bold. I'm going to put this as A for monochromatic, because I think there's a simplicity to it, but you can really make it look good. Okay, next up we have hand-painted textures. I think it can look absolutely beautiful, absolutely amazing. You have to have real artistic skills. You need to be able to paint something so it looks beautiful and looks painterly. There might be some tools you could use to make it look that way, but I think if you're actually doing it by hand, it's going to be super difficult. Maybe not to the extent of Cuphead difficult, where you're drawing every single frame of every single animation, old school Disney style, but if you're trying to paint it and make it look beautiful, Ori and the Blind Forest, for example, or Grizz, these games look beautiful, but I think honestly they're way beyond what a new indie game developer can do, unless you're a specialist artist. So I'm going to put hand-painted as C. It's nearly a D, but I don't have the courage to put anything at D just yet, but maybe we'll shuffle things around as we go. Next up we have voxel. So voxel is really great from an efficiency point of view. It's easy to work with, it's simple. I mean, we've all played Minecraft, so we understand conceptually what voxel's all about. So there's some good performance benefits. Personally, I think it's going to make your game look like a Roblox game. It's going to make it look a little bit cheap and a little bit too simple as a voxel game. The art style is simple, like blop, 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 done. But I think it's been a little bit done, and I think it's difficult as an indie game developer to have your voxel game pop and look a little bit fresh and a little bit different. So I'm going to put that one at C as well. So voxel's currently bringing up the rear. Next up we have isometric. So isometric, old school classic RPG fixed camera Diablo style games is what I've got in my head with isometric. Also Age of Empires type games. Now, I don't want to start a big debate about orthographic versus isometric. Isometric is referring to the particular camera angle, but also then how the assets are made, how they're in a fixed position. However we slice or dice it, it's that fixed camera. What I really like is that you can hide a lot. You don't need as much background because you're just sort of pointing down at the ground. You can make one of those stealth tactics type games where you come around the corner and you don't need to be creating a lot of art. You just create what you need and what you see. The player's not zinging the camera around looking at everything. I think it looks a little bit dated and not quite as fresh, and it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to have things really pop and stand out. Usually, I think, because the camera's a little bit further back, you could drop in pretty much any sort of art assets in there and call it isometric and job done. And it does lend itself to a sort of retro, ye olden days feel to it. There's some nostalgia to it, is what I'm saying. So I think isometric, I like it personally. I think I'm going to give it a B, because you can hide a lot as an indie game developer with isometric, I think. Next up, pixel art. Okay, so pixel art is great in terms of being quick to get going. You can open up a pixel art piece of software and jump in. We did a battle video actually where there was 4 of us making pixel art. I was in there doing some pixel art myself, and me, who's not much of an artist, created something that I think was game worthy pretty quickly. Anyone can get in there with just a little bit of practice and make something. I think it's also got some really wonderful novelty capabilities to it. So I love Undertale. The look of it looks just so simple, but it's beautiful as well. And so what I mean by that is you can get some really good, if you get really good at pixel art, you can be very creative in unusual directions. Obviously, you can be Hyperlight Drifter level of beautiful and amazing, but you can also be Undertale kind of wacky, quirky. I think you can make a whole bunch of assets very quickly as well. It is a 2D style, so 2D games can be a little bit more simple. You can make your first game as a simple platformer or as a simple Zelda RPG, run around in the world type game. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say pixel art is S tier when it comes to an indie game developer making their first or their second or early journey games. I think pixel art is amazing. Okay, next up we have cel-shaded style. So, I think cel-shaded can look really beautiful, cartoony, bold, it can look different, it can look unusual. It can also look a little bit tired and stale, like, I've seen that before. But I think there's room to explore and experiment. The whole thing is trying to be stylized, so pushing it in a direction. It lends heavily upon the technical aspect, but if you've got some shader knowledge and you can make the textures look a certain way, then I think once again you can hide some of your lack of artistic abilities with your technical skills and knowledge. You can have something look beautiful because you're a programmer as opposed to beautiful because you're an artist. Even if you're terrible at modeling, you can model a Katamari Damacy style, like, there's a little guy with a big head, but then you can put some cool shading over the top of it. So I'm gonna put cel shading as an A, and I'm pretty sure the other folks on the team are not going to agree with that. Next up we have anime, and I think anime is sort of a cousin to cel-shaded. I had to dig into it and really have a think about, is anime always 2D or can it be 3D as well? So can Okami be anime, or is it just straight up hand-painted, cel-shaded, cartoon-looking type thing? Ace Attorney has that kind of anime look to it. Big eyes and in a very 2D style is very anime. Now, if we're assuming anime as 2D, I think you need a lot of illustration skill to get there. So if you already have that illustration skill, this would be S tier for you. Bingo, you've hit the jackpot because you're going to be able to do something that looks good straight away. I think for the rest of us who maybe aren't illustrators, I think it's going to be very difficult. So I'm tempted to put anime at D, but I know anime fans are going to get upset, so I'm going to be a little bit not courageous and I'm going to put it at C because I'm a little bit unsure. I think it could still be okay for some people, so we'll make it a C. Okay, next up is Stylized 3D. You can have a really strong visual identity with this style. So people can look at it and say, aha, I know exactly what game that is. It doesn't look like every other game of the style. So you can look at a Fortnite character, you're like, that's definitely Fortnite. You can look at Team Fortress and you can say that's definitely Team Fortress, or Rocket League. I think 3D, if you're okay at 3D, it can be not too difficult to create 3D assets. But stylized, you kind of have to be reasonably good at it. So it definitely loses points for, you need to be pretty good as an artist to make stylized 3D, but I think it gains points in terms of really standing out, looking good and popping and being something that you could really throw your weight behind in terms of a brand. I'm going to put it at B just because it's more difficult to look good. If you're not really a 3D artist and you're playing around and you're kind of new to it, then going to be difficult to make that look really good. Maybe if you're making a car game and you really like modeling cars, but I'm going to put it as a B for now. Maybe above Isometric. Stylized 3D and then Isometric on the B level. Right, next up we have vector art. I'm super biased on this because I played a lot of ye olden days Flash games. I played games on Congregate and Armor games. I really love that. I've taught courses making Scratch games, and my kids have played Scratch games, and Scratch is very much a vector environment. So vector is a 2D art style as opposed to pixel art, where you're putting a pixel in a particular spot. It's a rasterized image, like the pixels actually go into place. Vector is mathematical formulation between here's a point and here's a point, and there's a bend on the curve. So it scales very well. It looks good on mobile, looks good on larger screens because it doesn't get that distortion as things stretch. So you can have it across multiple different platforms. I think it's going to look pretty good. So some Hollow Knight, for example, the characters in Hollow Knight, vector art, Brawlhalla, their characters, even something more South Park as the actual cartoon itself, and the video game version of South Park is using vector art. And I think vector art is really great for that. If your first game you're looking to put on itch.io, you're looking to put somewhere that's more of a casual game platform, I think vector art can look really sharp and hide some of that imperfection, I think. So vector art, it's not quite at the A level. I'm going to put that as a B level. I think I'm going to put that above isometric, so on the B level. I quite like vector art. I think for a beginner, you can do a lot with vector art pretty quickly. Next up, we have low poly 3D art, and this is where the other folks on our team are going to totally maybe yell at the monitor and disagree with me. I am going to put low poly as S tier. I absolutely love it, love it, love it as a very first art style for you to get into. If you look at people in game jams, there's a lot of pixel art and there's a lot of low poly 3D art. I'm a big fan of Cinti art, Cinti assets. We use them in a lot of our courses that we create, and people might say, but everything looks like Cinti, it's out there everywhere. It's out there everywhere because it's so simple and easy to use. If you're going with that low poly art style, it's very fast to create. You can get into Blender and you can learn for a short amount of time, and then you can make your own character pretty quickly because you're reducing the amount of polys, the amount of polygons, so the amount of faces you've got on your character. It's deliberately not trying to look like a real character, so it's very forgiving, I think, as an art style. And if you look at games like Astroneer that have a low poly art style, that's a beautiful looking game, and it's been a very successful indie game. It's using low poly. Super Hot was taking a more creative way of saying, let's have a very white world and red characters, but it was very low poly. It wasn't about how detailed the models looked. It was about the overall presence of the game, the overall experience. And Crossy Road, if you want to go more of a like very, very, very simple kind of boxes, then you can look at Crossy Road as an example from many, many years ago. That was just very simple, beginner friendly. You can make a box and kind of put a couple of eyes on it and there's a chicken. So there's a lot of range. It's very powerful. Okay, and we have one left, which is photorealistic. After talking about low poly, this is completely the other end of the spectrum. So photorealistic can be quite intensive on your computer. You need to have the big textures in there. You need to have a lot of polygons on your assets. But it can be so immersive, so powerful, so amazing if it's done well. If you look at Red Dead Redemption 2, I love that game. It's just, you feel like you're there. I'm an actual gunslinger, so I'm actually in the world. Street Fighter 6 is super realistic nowadays. Call of Duty type games, Mass Effect back in the old days. It's really trying to say, we want you to feel like you're there and just be like, wow, this is the actual world, photorealistic. However, one thing I've learned when making indie games and being relatively new to this journey, if you're making your first indie games, is if you go photorealistic and you get just one thing slightly wrong, everything breaks and everything looks like trash. So if you're making photorealistic and your animation kind of glides a little bit or is a little bit clunky, people look at it and be like, whoa, that's not a real person. Whereas if you're making something stylized or something low poly, you can get away with it. There's a lot of forgiveness because people, they suspend their disbelief. They get there and say, clearly this is not supposed to be an actual person. It's a video game person. So they forgive you all those little missteps. Whereas photorealistic, you have to get it absolutely bang on perfect. So if you can do that, it's a high risk, high reward venture, I think. I'm going to put this, because I don't have one yet, and the guys on the team are going to yell at me if I don't have a D tier. I'm going to put photorealistic as D, because if you make one little misstep, it can really break the entire experience of your game. I think it's really, really, really tough to pull off. If you do, it can be amazing, but it can require a ton of effort and work and big teams. A lot of the examples I gave are from AAA games. I think indies should steer away from photorealistic.
Interesting choices there, Rick. I agree with some of them, but I think you're well off on a few. Personally, I have pixel art and monochromatic as the S tier as well. I agree with you on pixel art, it's very easy to make, but I also think monochromatic is quite simple too. To me, there's a lot of similarities between that and pixel art. In A, I've got these. I'm not sure what you're doing putting voxel art in C. I think it's easy to make cubic worlds with little effort. I've got hand painted, anime and vector all at B. I think they're all quite similar in a way. They all require a bit of an artistic flair. I'm not too bad at drawing, but I'm not the best, so it takes me a while to do something pretty cool. That's why I've kind of stuck it in the middle of the road there at B. I'm going to put isometric and stylized 3D at C. Isometric, I'm just awful at perspective stuff, and stylized 3D, you've kind of got to have some kind of creative vision and know what you're doing and what direction the art's going to go. I don't have the patience for that kind of thing, so no, not for me. We'll leave that one in C. And like you, Rick, I nearly put photorealistic in D, but I decided to put it in C because there's some games where you don't need a lot of animation. Think of Firewatch, for example. I know that's more of a low poly game, but you get some pretty cool realistic textures from Megascans, or Fab they call it nowadays. If it's just, you know, walking around like a walking simulator, so to speak, yeah, that can look pretty awesome with very little input to animation. And Cel-Shaded at A, nah, not for me. Nah, far too many shaders to get my head around for that one. And what about you, Will? What do you have?
Alright, well, now that you two have your terrible lists out the way, it's time for the most goated of opinions. I've actually got 4 art styles in S tier. We're talking monochromatic, pixel art, vector, and low poly. Why so many? Well, the main reason being that if you're a beginner with these 4 art styles, you get the most bang for your buck, I feel. I feel like you guys have been a little too harsh on a few of them. But yeah, you guys are absolutely right about pixel art. It's super easy. It's easier to pick up and learn and get good at than some of the other art styles mentioned, especially monochromatic, right? You could combine monochromatic and pixel art to form, you know, you really limit your color palette, a really punchy art style. I think vector and low poly, they do take slightly longer to learn, but I'm putting them in S tier because they separate themselves. One of the best bangs for your buck 3D wise, and then vector art for a similar reason, fairly easy to learn, fairly easy to pick up and make some good looking stuff with. Isometric and voxel go in A tier just because there's an extra step to those art styles that I feel you can only achieve once you've got fairly good. Moving on to stylized 3D, that's a lot harder. You got to become quite proficient at 3D, but it's definitely possible because stylized can be anything. You can take low poly and you can just kind of stylize it a bit and you end up with stylized 3D. But because of the wide variety of stylized 3D games, I'm putting it in B tier. As you guys have already said, hand painted, anime, and cel shaded are quite tough. You know, you guys have already hit the nail on the head with these, which is that they require an extra skill set. They require you to be quite good at either drawing or doing hand painting work. I must agree with Rick that photorealism goes in D just because it's just so hard. It takes thousands and thousands of hours of manpower for these AAA studios to perfect it and make it look really good. For example, you've got to be really good at specific kinds of shading for hair, eyes, different materials. You've got to understand high poly counts, let alone low poly counts. Stay away.
So there's my list. I just couldn't differentiate on the S tier between pixel art and low poly art. I think they are both the best options for someone who's making their first game. If you love 2D, go pixel. If you love 3D, go low poly 3D art. And you can add some stylization to either of those two, make it super colorful, or you can make it more sort of bland. It's totally up to you. Those for me are the absolute best art styles. But I know that's controversial. I know some people are going to disagree. I know that you might have your own thoughts. So please let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. And my concluding comment in all of this is it honestly doesn't matter what art style you use for your first game. If you already know how to do something, do that. Do the art style that you know. Do the art style that you know you can actually get done as well. And don't worry if it looks good or doesn't look good. Just make it so that it's an enjoyable experience and have the art be a bonus if it actually works out well. So don't let art block you from making your game. The important thing is you get in there and do it. I've tried to pick a couple of art styles for you that I think are the easiest to get in there and do it. And please let us know if you've already made a game, what art style did you use? And if you're about to make a game, what art style are you going to use? Thanks for watching. See you again soon.